Good afternoon. I'm Gideon Pogren, the director of the Gibbs Ethics and Governance think tank, and I'm very glad to welcome you to today's webinar. The subject, Speaking Truth to Power, Stories of South African Whistleblowers, couldn't be more relevant. Speaking Truth to Power has helped save South Africa from state capture, although of course we are still living with its devastating consequences. And whistleblowers have paid a particularly steep price for their truth-telling. Today's discussion is part of a much bigger project, a collaboration between Gibbs and Nottingham Business School, whose purpose is to better understand how we can support whistleblowers and enable speak-up cultures, both in organizations and in broader society. The discussion will be chaired by Professor Mollie Painter of Nottingham Business School, who is also the head of the Responsible Sustainable Business Lab there. And we have a wonderful panel, a panel made up of people who are perfectly qualified to speak about the subject. I can't think of people better qualified to speak about it. And we are very grateful for their agreeing to participate. We have Cynthia Stimpel, who was the former group treasurer of South African Airways. We have Suzanne Daniels, the former legal head of Eskom. And we have Dr. Claudelle von Eck, the former CEO of the Institute of Internal Auditors in South Africa. Cynthia and Suzanne are two of the most prominent whistleblowers in South Africa. And Claudelle has done crucial work in enabling speak-up culture in organizations, and she herself was a whistleblower. So once again, thank you very much to all of you for agreeing to participate. David Lewis, the head of Corruption Watch, was also going to participate, but unfortunately had to pull out because he's recovering from back surgery. So thank you very much to all of you for agreeing to participate. And I now have pleasure in handing over to Mollie.
Thank you, Gideon. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It's really a privilege to have these whistleblowers with us in this virtual room. And it's high time, I think, that we give whistleblowers the floor, albeit a virtual floor this time, but we're gonna have them do most of the talking. Right at the end, we're gonna offer some of the insights around our research. But before then, I'm gonna ask a few general questions just to get them to tell us their stories. So firstly, Cynthia, I would like to know, why not speak up? What are the barriers that whistleblowers face?
There are many, Mollie, thank you. In that, the first would be fear. Fear of victimization, fear that you will lose your job and have no income, fear of if you are the breadwinner in the family, you have to be the one taking care of either your children, or if you have additional families such as taking care of your parents and siblings, the fear of losing that job is far more greater than you wanting to speak up. And it takes a lot of courage. The other fear is that when you know the company is going to retaliate, when you know your colleagues are going to ostracize you and you become this pariah or this outcast, or they see you as a traitor. There's the other fear that, or should I say, that holds you back from speaking up, is when you have this internal ethical dilemma, asking yourself, should I speak out? What are the consequences? If I don't speak up, what are the consequences? And based on that, many of us go through this internal argument with ourselves before we make that decision. And sometimes it takes longer for others, and others will just say, this is what I believe in, this is my true values, this is my principles, I will speak up. And others take a longer turn. There are also reasons that people fear that if they will suffer threats from the organization, that, and I know of whistleblowers who have suffered that, is that we know where your children's school, or we know where you live, or you are a foreigner in this country, you will be deported. So there are those threats that holds us back.
Thank you. Suzanne, I would like to bring you in here. Can you talk a little bit more about the timing of whistleblowing? Why wait sometimes? What is the right moment to whistleblow? And in your case, how did you experience that period?
Thank you, Molly. I think the first thing to say is that there's actually no right time. There cannot be, it's easy to judge. I echo Cynthia's sentiments in terms of the fears that you feel. In my case, it was also more pronounced because I had physical threats directed at me and my daughter. So it took me a long time to reconcile, what I was seeing and how I was going to act on it. For me, in the beginning, I was a bit skeptical that what I was observing was actually happening, because it happened in a context where everybody was accepting of the status quo. And when I talk about everybody, I'm talking about the people that I worked with, the people that we reported to, and even at ministerial level, so it was very difficult for me to discern who was actually, for want of a better word, trustworthy. I suffered retaliation at ministerial level, at colleague level, quite, visibly in the media and all of those, even before I went to Parliament. I was also harassed at work. I had never been as sick as I was in the period leading up to my disclosure. And, there was quite a lot of corporate bullying before I actually made the decision. I had made the decision quite early on. If I look back now, I just didn't articulate it in the way that, that I said it out loud to myself. And when I did, I actually said to myself, now that you know, what are you going to do about it? And as Cynthia spoke about that internal conflict, that's how the internal conflict manifested on my side was, okay, you can't be skeptical anymore. You've satisfied yourself. Now what are you going to do about it? And finding myself in that position, I actually approached my lawyer. Initially, it was about my employment situation, but then I asked her that, I want to disclose these things. How do I go about it? Because my idea was to go public, call a media conference and just get it out there. And obviously, lawyers were a little bit more risk aware and told me that the best possible way to do that would be to make my disclosures in Parliament, because by that time we had heard that there was going to be a rumbling, that there was a rumbling of this parliamentary inquiry coming, or at least at that stage we were still talking about the Commission of Inquiry, and so that I would be able to then provide my evidence there. That was delayed. So, when you talk about timing, it really depends on the factors. Because those in my particular case, that was the advice that I heeded. And then I obviously waited, and the committee was delayed and all of that. So I only got to speak in November of that year, while I had made the decision earlier on. And I think it really depends on people's personal experiences. There are universal themes about, the threats at work, the threats to your family, your own considerations of whether you're going to have a job or not. I think there came a point in my journey that I realized that I was not going to go back to Eskom. I was never going to go back. So that point came, I was suspended like numerous times. And then I think during that, at the beginning, I was hopeful. And some point during that delays, I realized that I'm not going to go back. So it's kind of, everybody's journey is slightly different. but I think the fears are inherently the same. And, you know, ostracization from your colleagues and the isolation is actually the worst to bear. Because one day you're surrounded by friends who support you, supposedly, and the next day when you have decided to do this, you have none of those friends. And I mean, even they turn on you, they're actually the biggest critics of saying that you're lying and that you just, you know, why didn't you speak up earlier and all of those things. So it is a very delicate balance. So I would urge people not to judge the timing so much, because there's a journey in every whistleblower that gets to the point where they're actually ready to speak and actually have the courage to speak out.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. That's really insightful. And I want to encourage our audience listening also, if you have further questions on this, to post it in the Q&A. But if we just listen to this story of internal conflict, of other players involved, of colleagues turning against and friends turning against you, Claudelle, can you help us with how organizations can perhaps make this a little bit easier on the whistleblowers, at least give some support? Who should give support in these moments?
Thank you, Molly. I'll just add one more thing to what both Cynthia and Suzanne said, and that is sometimes the fear is not just about consequences to yourself, and Cynthia pointed to the family and being threatened as well, but sometimes it is also about your concern around people being targeted within the organization, people within your team. So if you speak up, they may target your team, you know, so that it can become very complex, which does add to the why you need to think very carefully through how you speak up, when you speak up, where do you take it to. Very importantly, I think that organizations that are serious about creating a speak up culture must make sure that they build it into their strategies around creating an ethical culture. Right? So it's got to be a holistic approach. You can't just take it in isolation. So your culture is going to determine to what degree whistleblowers are able to come forward and to what degree they will feel safe. And that needs to be, the processes around that need to be clear, it needs to be communicated, so everybody knows, and that what do I do when I want to speak up, who do I go to, and deal with the trust issues within the organization as well. And this is, I think, starts with the board, and the board has got to make a conscious decision that we are going to make sure that we're going to build an ethical culture in this organization. We're going to put the measures in place to give us assurance that the necessary interventions are there and that they are effective. And that support, I think you would probably need a combination. And it really depends on the skill set that you've got inside the organization as well. Because when somebody goes into a deep depression, for example, because of the result of having to deal with this very, very complex issue of blowing the whistle, you may not have the support within the organization. So you may need to bring somebody in, you need to maybe bring a professional in from outside, like a psychologist, but preferably somebody who understands the journey that the whistleblower has to walk through, you know. So the ideal situation would be if the organization is able to assign somebody who would walk alongside the whistleblower through the process. But you almost need to have that put in place already. By the time there is something that somebody wants to blow the whistle on, they need to know how the structure, how it works, how the process works. If it fails within the organization in terms of support, and that happens, so in the Eskom example, so if you're going, even if you go outside to your higher authorities, to the minister, and the support is still not there, I think one of the pillars in society that play a very important role are the professional bodies. And we've seen in the last few years that professional bodies have been forced to really step up in this area, which is why the Anti-Intimidation Ethical Practices Forum was created, so that they have somewhere to go to get that support. There's so many things that are happening. It's your mental health, it's the legal things that you've got to deal with, the complexity around it, and the bigger the issue, of course, the more support you need. But then, of course, one needs to ask the question, are the professional bodies getting themselves into a state of readiness to deal with that kind of thing? Do they have structures internally to support people to going through this kind of thing?
Thank you. I want to ask two follow-up questions, going back to our two whistleblowers, because listening to the interview that we had with you again, it seems to me that sometimes there are organizations that make statements around codes of ethics and whistleblowing. I remember in the days when I was still working in South Africa, Eskom was one of the first to have a code of conduct in an ethics program and such. And so I want to ask Suzanne, what do you do when you realize that those things aren't really working very well? Or are they? Or are they just insufficient? How could they be used to support whistleblowers?
To be very honest, Mollie, I don't think, well, Eskom was very good at putting policies in place. I think the implementation lacked commitment. We were supposed to have like a network of ethics officers. It was often under-resourced, and it was an add-on to some junior person's responsibility to fill out the reports. So I would say that it really isn't, while the policies and stuff are first class, the implementation was severely lacking. And in the environment that I worked, it was extremely power driven and hierarchical. So depending on where you were in that hierarchy, you would be able to squash someone who was talking about things. In my case, I went to the board, which was the custodian of the ethics policy and all the policies in Eskom. And that's where my victimization started. So, you know, that's when it became part of, well, it manifested more visually and physically than it had before that. So I don't think that in the current, well, I can only speak for my state-owned enterprise, but I don't think that state-owned enterprises are geared to actually deal with it. It requires an external sort of oversight. And I don't think that actually the way that the companies are structured and the political overlays, I don't think that it is really possible to give that comfort and that guidance and support to whistleblowers in the way that it's supposed to be. You know, the first reaction to my speaking out was to suspend me and to find reasons to suspend me. So I think that is the traditional, whether it's public or private sector, that has been the traditional way to deal with whistleblowers in the corporate environment in South Africa. And what we've discovered, I think, across the world. So, you know, I think from the beginning, companies need to look at themselves and really, really, really look inward and say, are they prepared to deal with what comes out? You know, because often you find the board is not prepared for that. The EXCO is not prepared for that at all. You know, I mean, I spoke to my EXCO colleagues. I don't think they, I mean, the look of disbelief on their faces, kind of thing. So it's easier to brand the whistleblower as part of the corruption than to actually deal with what the whistleblower is saying. That's just what I found. So I think, you know, there has to be a real hard look in corporate South Africa as to what ethics means and how they're going to actually implement it.
Thank you. Cynthia, I want you to come in here as well, because you had quite some experience with board members changing and all of the fluctuation in SAA. How do you deal with a situation where the board is not really capable? As Suzanne also just pointed out, they're perhaps not prepared. They don't know how to deal with it.
Yes, exactly. In the case of, firstly, let's just go back a bit to the Code of Ethics. I see that as a tick box exercise for most organizations. So everyone will paste their values firstly up there. That's their values, whether they, like KPMG had integrity, South African Airways had integrity, most of the major corporations have it. Then they have their Code of Ethics, they have their whole list of compliance. And literally, I see that as a tick box exercise because with my case of whistleblowing, the minute I realized that this was going against our compliance, against our procedures, against all our policies, I raised it with the compliance head. I raised it with internal audit. I raised it directly with my senior, who was the person perpetuating the problem. And then I took it to 2 executive Exco members. And still, everyone wants to distance themselves from it. In the case of how board deals with it, with South African Airways, unfortunately, board was part of the problem. So looking back at their history, they went through many years of changeover, so there was no continuity. In the early years of 2000, I think it was as early as 2010-11, when Cheryl Carolus headed up as chairperson and various others, they walked out. They were actually one of the few board members that stood up and said, we cannot manage this organization if there's interference from Department of Public Enterprises, because they needed certain things to be done. For instance, the balance sheet was high debt, and they wanted to fix that problem. And the Minister of Finance at the time didn't want to be involved with that, said no. And they said, we can't turn this company around if that's the problem. So then you had this problem where the board members all walked out, which made the room for other board members to come in that had their own ulterior motives or whatever different agendas. As Claudelle earlier stated, that it is board's requirement. Firstly, they've got to have the best interest of that organization at heart first. Secondly, is they got to have oversight and not be involved operationally. And if anything comes to their notice of any whistleblowing issues or any corruption issues, fraud, or whatever the issue that's not related to what it's supposed to be according to the processes or the procedures or the compliance issues, they're the ones that should immediately be raising those red flags, and they're not. So unfortunately, from what my readings of late have been over the past couple of years in South Africa, is that we found that our boards are not that astute anymore. And they're not courageous and brave enough to say, we are the board and the buck stops with us. And we need to be the ones to start asking the right questions. And I find that too many board members are sitting there rather to earn, because the majority of the huge companies, they would earn the money and not work for it, not question, not challenge. And that to me, I find is really sad that we've come to this point, because most times issues are picked up very early. And it's picked up by whistleblowers rather than internal audits that are done or external audited. And there are stats to reveal that the bulk of issues picked up early days are from whistleblowers, and they are the ones that are ignored or pushed aside or victimized. So I truly find that here's an opportunity for corporates to start looking at how can we get everyone involved in the company where they will not be victimized, because that's one of the main reasons people don't speak out, because they've already had the history of being victimized or listening to others that would have stopped them. I saw there was on the chat somebody saying about a hotline. the hotline is definitely there. There are all those rules in place, but when you use it, and depending on who manages it, they can easily turn that around to victimize the person. So in the case of SA, we had a hotline whereby one of our whistleblowers went through that hotline. It went to our internal audit. From our internal audit, it went to board, and immediately that person was suspended. In my case, I didn't go through the hotline. What I did do is I reported it firstly to the very person who was the CFO, saying that I'm going to take this further. This is not what we should be doing. And I took it to Exco. From Exco, I took it then to the next reporting line for SA, which was External National Treasury. And with that, I got suspended. So whichever, as long as you followed the process of the Protected Disclosures Act, you will, depending on whoever controls it, would then decide if they are ethical, they will put it in the right context. But if they're not, they're going to push it out and you will get suspended.
Thank you. I want to bring Claudelle in here also just to respond to some of the comments on the chat. So Lisa Texera is asking, the regulatory bodies, do they really work? If they are approached with non-compliance, their general response is, hey, it's an employment matter, we cannot get involved. And she's also wondering whether the non-execs would speak out, because if they do, they may not have their contracts extended. What do you think, Claudelle?
Look, I think we have a mixed bag. I think that there are some regulators who are doing a good job, and then there are regulators who are not. And for me, we tend to talk in broad terms about organizations. It's really about individual people, human beings sitting in there, right? So if you look at a regulator, the regulator may be strong today because there are strong individuals there today who understand very clearly the concept of protecting the interest of the public. And then you have a change of guard, and then it changes again. Now, what is very important is that I think number one is the induction process of your leaders coming into organizations, whether they are leading an organization from a board perspective or whether they are leading a regulatory body, to make sure that there is a very clear understanding, of what ethics is. I worry a little bit that people tend to confine ethics to fraud and corruption only, and it goes broader than that. Understanding what the ripple effects are on the long-term sustainability of creating a culture where people can't speak up, where you're squashing whistleblowers. You know, so I think in a lot of cases, people don't see the ripple, they don't see the long-term effect. So they don't think it is as big a problem as the whistleblower is making it out to be. So if you can't see the big picture and you can't see the ripple, then of course you're going to treat it as not really all that important. So for me, I almost want to classify the leaders in two big categories. And of course, I mean, there's lots of complexity in it, but the two big categories are, for me, the one group that are really just a bad bunch of apples. They are corrupt. They make sure that they bring their buddies in. And so the organization then becomes rotten. And then you have another category, which I think is the bigger category. And maybe it's just the optimist in me that thinks that is the bigger category. And that is organizations where the leaders want to do the right thing. They don't want an unethical culture within the organization, but really they don't know what to do. You know, and I think Cynthia alluded to the people not knowing how to deal with a situation like that. So it comes back for me to taking that very holistic approach to creating an ethical culture and training. So you've got to train the board on their responsibilities in terms of an ethical culture. What are the components? that make up an ethical culture? What is the board's responsibility in terms of oversight from that perspective? And let them understand. So, and also, what do you do when you're now sitting with an ethics crisis within the organization, or when a whistleblower comes forward with a material issue? So the board knows how to respond. Because when they're not trained, they don't know how to respond. They're like a deer with headlights. They don't know. So then people make mistakes. And then they end up doing things that just make things worse. And when things are worse, then they start to try and cover up. Yeah. The same goes within the organization. Managers are very seldom trained how to deal with a whistleblower. So if somebody walks into my office today and comes and blows the whistle, what are the next steps? What are the processes that I need to follow? Yeah. So that I don't make it worse. You know, so you sometimes get a situation where the whistleblower walks into one manager's office, the manager goes and talks to the person who's accused, and then things just blow up, and then the whistleblower becomes victimized. So the organization knows how to intelligently deal with it when the whistle is blown. It minimizes a situation where the perpetrators can then victimize the whistleblowers. But it's also in the ethics training and making sure that at managerial level, it's not just about understanding ethics and understanding what I refer to ethics intelligence, and that is your ability to see ethical implications and to navigate through ethical dilemmas. And most of us need to be trained. And the world has become so complex with so many different kinds of ethical issues. And that without the training, it can stand right in front of you and you won't recognize what is in front of you. So it's also training them in terms of helping people to become ethics intelligent, but also train how to manage ethics. And managing ethics in the organization is different to just understanding ethics and my responsibility to speak up as a whistleblower.
Thank you.
Did I answer the question?
Yes, that's excellent. Thank you so much. And there's lots of agreement with what you're saying in the Q&A, but also more and more questions, and quite a few questions about which institutions can whistleblowers really report to in South Africa. And really, if those regulatory bodies are functioning, how could they be made more prominent? Do you have any ideas on that? Anyone?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought you were directing the. So I think the regulatory bodies do need to do a little more in sensitizing the public around their role, so that everybody knows and knows how to find information, how to report. And then also transparency in terms of feedback. And the more that kind of information circulates within society, I think it makes it easier for people to speak up. But as I said earlier on, it also, I think, a lot of training, and it's part of the induction process as well, because it is the leadership. It's the individual sitting in that board of the regulatory body. If they apply their minds properly, then you are going to see that communication come through that should be coming through. And then the regulatory body would then become more effective. I do think, though, that sometimes we are very unrealistic about how much a regulatory body can do with the resources that it has. You know, the same goes to professional bodies. So and it's the same principle around the issue that was raised earlier on, asking whistleblowers to report very quickly. You know, there's a process, there's a journey. You need to think about the capacity. So if we're not giving the regulatory bodies enough capacity, and you increase the whistles that are being blown at their office, and then they can only run so fast. And we have to look at it from a very balanced perspective, I think.
Thank you. Well, we want to move on now a little bit to possible repair. How do we repair the damage done to whistleblowers? We spoke a lot about the pariah status. In all of the interviews we conducted, I was just left so traumatized and sad for these lives that have been severely affected through whistleblowing. So Cynthia, could you give us some thoughts on that, please?
Yes, I do have some thoughts there, Molly. Looking at South Africa, firstly, is we have a Protected Disclosures Act, whereby if you disclose under those 4 key proponents under the PDA, which I'll just call PDA for now, Protected Disclosures Act, is that you should be protected and not suffer detriment, as in losing your job or be victimized, etc. However, we sit with the Protected Disclosures Act on the one side. The minute anyone discloses, and I think out of research, there were probably 2 cases where people were awarded their positions back in the organization. However, they were not put back into the same job or specific function that they were doing, and they were placed in another function that was totally as a demotion, and which subsequently through that they leave. So in effect, if one looked at it through every whistleblower, this act has not protected anyone. When you look at our Constitution, there's a section in our Constitution that says that we have, under Section 15, that everyone has the right to their belief, to their conscience, to their freedom of association, so their right to freedom of conscience, religion, thought, belief, and opinion. With the whistleblower, when they whistleblow, it's something that they see that is not right, be it unlawful, be it just not complying, etc. And with that, they go with that belief, their conscience is, I need to report this. And so on the one hand, you see your Protected Disclosures Act literally not protecting the disclosure then becoming totally victimized, suffering trauma, suffering either psychological impact or psychiatric impact, loses current income, loses future income, and it takes a long while for that person to get back onto their feet, which is seldom out there. And then, I believe that we need to go back to that Protected Disclosures Act. We need to declare it unconstitutional in our country because it is really not protecting anyone. Exactly, thank you. And then I've researched what the US have done. They, in their 4th agreement, they also, the one part protects and the other doesn't, but they've evolved and they've come up with quitam ruling and a way of reporting that it is not malicious or that it is deliberately trying to undermine someone, but this is facts that we're reporting against the process. And with that legislation, they found that more people are now whistleblowing because there is some protection, A, and B is if you have followed the rules by managing to stop corruption, and they focus more on the focus of corruption, you're able to have a reward for that. And the US system is now working that more whistleblowers are coming out. Other countries like the UK are still debating it, as well as the Australian legislation. They're also looking at it. But many are now putting in some whistleblowing legislation to protect the whistleblower because they're finding that that whistleblower is truly not protected and definitely suffers detriment.
Thank you for that. Suzanne, I want you to come in here as well, please. What do you think? Should there be financial compensation or at least some kind of financial help for whistleblowers?
Okay, I'm going to start by saying no amount of financial reward or help is ever going to repair what we have to go through in the process of whistleblowing. It would be welcome because once you are branded a whistleblower, there's a stigma attached to you. I very soon realized, that I won't be able to work in another corporate environment because of the stigma attached to me, because of what I had done. by speaking out. That also makes you a pariah, whether it's for good or not. And for me, in this situation, I can honestly tell you, looking back at the last 3 years of my life, I don't think any amount of money is going to make me feel good about what I had to go through, the threats to myself, my family, my daughter, and those kinds of things, the various attempted break-ins at home that I've had, all those things, no amount of money is going to make up for it. What needs to be done is, and especially I think in the state capture environment, you cannot quantify the damage to the organization. So the kinds of legislation that you have in other countries, it doesn't take into account the extent of what we have gone through. So even a small percentage of that would be welcome in terms of day-to-day living. But I think as far as reparation is concerned, I don't think there's anything that can do that. I fully support Cynthia in the fact that I think the Protected Disclosures Act is not worth the paper it's written on, because it didn't protect us. I was a firm believer in our Constitution and that I would be protected. And neither the Constitution nor the Protected Disclosures Act provided me with the protection that is inscribed in those pieces of legislation. I saw a question in the Q&A which asked, what do we think should be added to the Protected Disclosures Act? My view is the act should be scrapped and rewritten so that it could be written properly and not as an add-on to legislation, because that is what it became. And while the intention might have been good, it created another barrier for whistleblowers. Because firstly, the onus is on the whistleblower to prove that what he or she is doing is right. So, there's a double whammy. So with all the other things that you are facing, you are still having to prove. And I think that for me was the most frustrating bit of my journey, and the most disillusioning part of it was that I had to bear the onus of proving that I was speaking the truth, that I was, what my motives were, and all of those things when I had the evidence. I saw there was another question that asked, do you have to be 100% certain? It was directed at me. And for me, I think I'll answer the question in this way, is that for me, I was skeptical in the beginning, and being a trained lawyer, I wanted some measure of comfort that if I was going to upset the apple cart in the way that I thought I would, I needed some evidence. So my journey started with collecting that evidence. But I think for me, I said that, I can't convince myself any further when I had that meeting in Melrose Arch with Ajay Gupta. When I saw that, I told myself, I don't care what evidence you have, Suzanne, if you do not speak out now, you are going to be complicit. So there comes a point, where you just don't need any more evidence. You need to rely on your gut. And if I think Mollie, there's one thing that I've learned throughout this process, I will never, ever not trust my gut again and look for evidence. Do you know what I mean? It's a real double-edged sword. But the fact is that had I trusted my gut a lot more, I would have been able to deal with it, in a different way. But I suppose each experience is the same. And for people who've asked these questions, in terms of legislation and all of that, I really, as a lawyer, I don't think the legislation supports us. Really, it doesn't do much. It is so skewed in favor of a corporation, actually. They can throw you under paper. You have no funding to continue with this litigation and those kinds of things. So it is really an insurmountable battle in South Africa. you know, we don't have litigation financing and all of those things. So I think when we look at the Protected Disclosures Act, I'm a very strong advocate, get rid of the act, start all over again.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you again for the courage to tell us your story and, you know, live through the emotion of that. It's really not easy, and we do appreciate that a lot. Lots of support for what you're saying about the PDA in the chat. And then also just the issue that, you know, companies have big purses and therefore can run the whistleblower into the ground financially. So perhaps, Claudelle, if you want to come in here and just speak to us about other potential support, legal support, other supports that perhaps could be provided.
Yeah, can I just first say that there is for me, there's a broader issue here as well at play. And so we're talking about corporates, but it's also a societal issue. You know, in terms of how we view whistleblowers, that would have an impact on what comes into organizations. So often your organizations lend from they pull from the culture within society as well. So it's no good we point fingers at corporates, but we are not willing to stand with whistleblowers and support them. You know, so you're asking the question about other than the organization. And then from a legal support, I know that there are a lot of people in the legal profession that would do pro bono work to assist whistleblowers when it needs to be. And I know Corruption Watch has also helped a lot of people through the process. And there are different structures within society. I have never been a great supporter of only looking at legislation from a protection perspective, because those are just rules. At the end of the day, people bend rules and they break rules. The issue is around what do we value as a society, and how do we behave within the rules. So we can, I think, even if we change the legislation, which I think I agree is important to make the necessary changes so that we can see better protection. But that is it's almost reactive as opposed to being proactive. You know, so if I were to say to one of the bars here in South Africa, for example, do you have it as a priority to communicate to the public out there that if we were to look at it from the South African context perspective, we know that where we are now, that there is a huge problem in the country. Here we are, we will help you, we will support you. You know, civil society needs to step up when we are in situations like this. But I do want to just come back to the organization, and I think that the two broad categories that I talked about earlier on, and the building of the ethical courage. And I think if we focus more on that kind of thing in terms of proactive, your issues that you would have to deal with from a reactive perspective would come down. But we also, very importantly, I think that, and here I would speak very directly to professional bodies, in terms of how we train professionals. We train good professionals from a technical perspective, but we don't train people to deal with the corrupt people when they go and encounter them, right? So now you're dealing with people who are willing to go into spaces that you didn't even know existed. And it's like the degrees of evil that you suddenly discover, and spaces where you thought you were dealing with good people, or you're dealing with in organizations where integrity is supposed to be a top value, and then you see behavior and victimization coming from people who have the halo effect around them, and people don't question them because they've been allowed to become so powerful. So we do, I think, also need to work on, in terms of being proactive, training people, how to blow the whistle, how to deal with those kind of people. And sometimes you've got to strategize. Sometimes whistleblowers burn their fingers because they haven't gone about blowing the whistle in a manner that would protect them as well.
Thank you. There are so many interesting points coming out in the chat that we're definitely going to come back to them, hopefully right at the end. For now, we want to take the opportunity to share some of this incredible research that we've been able to do. We interviewed 27 whistleblowers, and this is where I would like to introduce the two people who've been very instrumental in this whole process, Dr. Teresa Unaji and Dr. Alme Vivia, to come in and share some of these results. We said to the whistleblowers that we interviewed that we won't just let this be a talk shop. We'll come up with some ideas on what needs to be done to progress this issue in future. And I think this conversation has been very meaningful in that regard. There's also a lot of requests for information in the chat. So hopefully by sharing all of this and by putting something nice together out of this conversation, there could really be some proactive ways in which we can take this issue forward. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Tess and Alme to lead us through what they've prepared for us. And the whole idea here is not to turn over to us as researchers, but to get the whistleblowers to comment on whether we got it right and what we are missing and how to take this forward. So Tess, please.
Thanks a lot, Molly, and thank you to the speakers, and thank you to the whistleblowers. Thanks for sharing your insights and just for the courage to do what you did. Thanks for that. I don't know if we could get the infographic that we've got just on the slide, but in terms of trying to understand how whistleblowing experiences have occurred in corporate South Africa, we embarked on a research project. So it's a research that's in partnership between Gordon Institute of Business Science and Nottingham Business School. And over the course of 3 months, we were able to interview 27 participants, including whistleblowers, 14 of them, and the people who support whistleblowers as well. And what we find, or what we found from our research, and it really collaborates what we've been speaking about this afternoon, is, in terms of the choice to speak out by whistleblowers, a lot of times what the research has shown is that people speak out for their values, their personal values of right and wrong. And some of them speak out because of the moral courage that they possess and the fact that they're willing to stand for what they believe in. So on the slide, there's one of the quotes from one of the participants who categorically said that, I would rather be jobless and proud of myself than be a victim for the rest of my life. So this definitely reflects what we've been talking about today in terms of the reasons why people decide to blow a whistle and speak out against what they think is wrong. Just the fact that there is a social and cultural upbringing that guides the decisions that they have made. And regardless of the challenges that they end up facing. So I know Suzanne and Cynthia alluded to the fear of deaths to their lives and the fear of job losses. And this came up very strongly in our research as well. So we had one of the participants stating that, I have 20 years experience, not even looking for a salary that I used to earn, and I still can't get a job. If we could just move down the slide. So, it's a case of you lose your job. So this is from the data. There's a fear of losing your job. There's a fear of, financial insecurity. There's a fear of isolation, which Claudelle spoke to as well, where, you speak out and it almost seems like no one trusts you anymore. Your colleagues can't talk to you anymore. And this came up very clearly in the data we've gathered. So there's the fear of the belief that nothing will be done in response to your courageous act. And that's one of the things that we got from the research as well. I know in today's forum, we've spoken about the whistleblower as pariah, and that is a strong price that whistleblowers have to pay when they do choose to speak out. And it cuts across the whistleblowers we spoke to, the fact that, no one really trusts you anymore. And in fact, at some point, you're perceived as bringing too much integrity to the organization, hence they don't want you around anymore. So these are some of the things that our research has shown. Just in terms of our recommendations from the research, I don't know if I can call on May just to walk us through, what are some of the recommendations that our research is pulling out. Thank you.
Thank you, Tess. And can I ask that the slide please be moved down again? So these are the price of speaking out and further down. Thank you. And maybe we can just pause here, and I'll just highlight to pull out, following on from what Tess just spoke about, some of the key quotes that we found really give expression to the kinds of costs that people pay. I'll just pull a few out here. You are guaranteed to lose your job. We spoke about that. It's the loneliest journey I've ever been through. I can't see the whole thing that's on my side. And so on. And the next, if you move down further, great. So this is where I will pick up also on the conversation that has been going on so far about the kinds of recommendations to better support whistleblowing, but also speak out cultures more broadly. And I'll sketch out just a range of the recommendations that came from the interviews, many of these confirming exactly what the panel's already been discussing and warrant further consideration. This will still not be exhaustive though, and so I do welcome people who have already taken to making further recommendations on the chat to keep doing so. So the first thing really is around support. This was a major thing that both whistleblowers and non-whistleblower interviewees agreed on. This would be in the form of financial support, the need for physical protection to be provided to whistleblowers, legal support, legal advice on how to blow the whistle. Claudelle, you spoke about this, gathering evidence, being strategic about it. There were cases where people said, if I had just known, to keep more records and so on, and support for mental and physical health. Organizations have a role to play here that could actually provide financial support, for instance, for physical protection to a whistleblower, counseling, and so on. And these are important because, as you also discussed, blowing the whistle is not about a single act that happens and then it's done. It's a very protracted, costly, painful process and often requires speaking up again and again. Then there were recommendations for external support structures to be established, such as in the form of industry-based and funded NGOs that could run programs. And you also gave an example of the Anti-Intimidation Ethical Practices Forum, Claudelle. So more of those are needed. You spoke about the Protected Disclosures Act. In principle, should be providing for protection. And yes, all across our interviews, there's agreement that this largely does not help in practice. People often don't know about it, don't know even what their rights are. HR practitioners themselves not fully aware of the act and the amendments made to the act. It's not being enforced, and there are no consequences for the lack of fulfillment of the PDA. An interesting suggestion that came here was that unions should actually be more demanding of companies to comply with the act. We can perhaps shift that to say they should be more demanding that the act be scrapped. I'll leave that for debate. Other institutional structures that are also important here, we spoke about audit firms and the professions. Quite specific recommendations were made around auditors making better and more use of companies' whistleblowing reports, asking for those statistics of how many reports were received and asking for evidence of the corrective action being taken or not taken to see what actually happens there. There was recognition that there's a lot of pressure on compliance officers and companies to enforce regulations without necessarily adequate support from regulators. So Claudelle, you mentioned what regulators need to do as well. And broadly, the sense that we got from the interviews there was that a clearer, stronger stance on ethics and compliance is needed. Issues of confidentiality and anonymity, and this comes back to the ethics hotline, external ethics hotlines that should be in place, hosted by independent third parties, but also perhaps the need for due diligence on those third parties and the members in those organizations to make sure that they are treating the information disclosed through those channels properly. And training, many suggestions around training, in particular, training for those within organizations who would receive internal disclosures so that they are better equipped to know how to handle information with care, how to ensure confidentiality, protect against victimization, how to fulfill the requirements of the PDA around that kind of protection, and also to know how to give feedback to people on how these reports are being dealt with. And accompanying that kind of training, and in parallel to that, were also recommendations around instilling deeper ethical awareness and empathy. And I think this comes back to the points around speak out cultures and understanding that ethics is not just the very obvious extreme cases of fraud and corruption, but also about being able to speak out on small matters, on anything, any organization. And leaders should understand why people would not speak out. Importantly, if they see that those who speak out are dealt with in difficult ways, and that wrongdoers are not actually having to face any kinds of consequences. So that's around training, but also the kinds of practices that get instilled in conversation in companies and organizations. What kind of conversations do we have in companies, and also among senior leadership and in boards? Build that kind of culture. Professional bodies in academia also have a responsibility here to better conscientize members and students about their role in the public service. And I'm going to wrap up here to say this idea around the stigma around whistleblowers also came through and needs to change. And the risks and sacrifices and moral courage of blowing the whistle needs to be recognized and celebrated, but also in very real ways. So I think this is also a point in time to look for ways to actually do that. So I've brushed the surface here from our side just to give a sense again of the kind of multidimensional, perhaps whole of society approach that would be needed. And I'll leave it at that and hand back over to you, Mollie.
Thank you, Almay. Thank you for you and Tessie too for putting this together so nicely for us. Cynthia, Claudelle, Suzanne, responses from any of you, please.
I agree. Yeah, sorry, Cynthia. I think what was said is sort of in broad strokes what I would have expected to see. I think the importance of legislation, Claudelle, just to pick up on a point that you've made, I think it's very important that there is something in place and there is something external to the organization and to the various regulatory bodies that there are that the whistleblower can turn to. Because in my case, even though I went to organizations, they were too scared to take on the case because it was so high profile. So, you know, you get another knock when you do that. I think intimidation within the organization must not be underestimated, because my CEO threatened me as well that they would make my life as hell as possible, and they proceeded to execute on that promise. So I think, you know, there must be some outside that doesn't involve human beings, especially when we're in an organization, in a society that is not really welcoming of whistleblowers. And I agree with you that there needs to be a lot of training and understanding of what ethics actually means. But until such time that we evolve in that regard, there needs to be some protection for whistleblowers. Otherwise, we are just going to become the same stories over and over again. And I think also, you know, just there actually is no incentive to blow the whistle in the current society.
And I just want to pick up on what is coming through the chat, because there's quite a few people saying that there's so much fake news, that whistleblowers are easily ostracized, that actually our society doesn't support whistleblowers. We don't like people who speak the truth for some reason. And another question was, are there employers that exist that would actually make a point of employing whistleblowers? Would that perhaps be something that we have to explore?
I would go with that, definitely, because once you've been a whistleblower, or at least I think we've been whistleblowers in our lives in many ways if we are ethical, and most of us will recall when and where, but in a corporate or where you're working, it just becomes a bigger issue. I would agree then that you should employ them, because if you value that organization, for instance, if I was a CEO of an organization and I know that I need to hold this company's reputation in the highest regard, I'm going to employ the type of people that have the same similar ethical values. And so it would be the idea. There's a guy called Charles Middleton, who's also been a whistleblower, and he's quite active on LinkedIn. And he actually also stated that that's where companies should go. Corporate should be employing whistleblowers if they want to enhance the reputation and keep the reputation of the organization. Going back to Alma's and Tessa's overall presentation that they gave, yes, I agree that that support is broad. We really need to have, and I love what they put together. I know up front I put the legislation, but it's broader than that. I put it because I thought we were going to still debate other issues. And I agree civil societies need to get involved. I've been fortunate in that Outer was my support as a whistleblower, in that when I didn't win within my organization and I didn't win in the next level of National Treasury, I went to Outer. They actually acted. And within acting as quickly as they did, we actually managed to stop the transaction from happening. And I saved 250 million for SA Airways. But instead, they didn't even see that as saving that money. They saw it as, why did you do it? So there's so civil society, I believe, plays a huge role. And I know Corruption Watch is one of them. The regulators definitely need to. Institute of Directors are now currently really focusing on any reports that would come around directors who are not following their code of conduct as a director. There's the Institute of Risk Management South Africa. So many are coming now on board because they're far more aware. And I think perhaps if they also put the group together and look at one, you know, that it doesn't just go to SICA or the Institute of Internal Auditors and it stays there. Whatever comes out, it's grouped, because then they can see, but we've got this director sitting here or that or this person, and they're able to then work more agile and quickly to say, here's something we can work on and stop it and prevent it. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. Cynthia, I think a number of professional bodies have already gone the route of working together and sharing information. I know that an MOU had been signed among some of them in terms of holding their members accountable and also stopping this thing from people hopping from one professional body to the other, and then nobody can catch them, you know, so that information is important. What has been shared in terms of the results absolutely resonates with me. I think that most of the important, the salient issues have been captured. I don't disagree with you, Suzanne, on the legislation issue, and I think it is important that it's there, but I think it's more important that we start building a society with strong values, where whistleblowing is not just accepted but welcomed and encouraged, and that we do see more support. So like you said, Cynthia, let's see organizations employing and visibly employing whistleblowers, so that A, it takes the stigma away, and B, people know that if I speak up and I lose my job here, somebody else will catch me very, very quickly because they want people like me. We need to make sure that we tell people that there is a cost. You know, especially when you are in a position of leadership, that most of us think it's not going to happen to us. At some point, at will, you know, and I have this visual in my head of the movie Taken with Liam Neeson, his daughter is, she's on the phone with the daughter, and he says to her, don't be scared, they're going to take you. You know, and we almost need to be able to say to people, look, the possibility of this happening to you is good, but don't worry, we're coming for you. You know, we just hang on, the bad guys are gonna get you, but we'll come and we'll come and fetch you. But it becomes a collective effort. You know, so when we're talking about money, I don't want us to see it as just a reward thing. I think it's more, if we're gonna give people, whistleblowers money, it is to help them to pay for the costs that come with it. So that you're not having whistleblowers driven by wanting to get money, but you are getting whistleblowers to blow the whistle for the right reasons, because we all want to protect humanity from a long-term perspective.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudelle. And thank you all for this conversation. If you just read what's happening in the chat, people are applauding you for your courage, saying thank you on behalf of the country. And I think this last message is very powerful, to say these things are going to happen to good people, but let's come for them. Let's come to their assistance. Let's give them the support that they need. Let's give each other some moral support. And I love this panel, because I think as a group of strong women, it really inspires me to listen to you. So thank you so much for telling your stories once again, for giving us advice, for remaining positive that something good can come out of this. And I certainly hope it will. And with that, we say thank you for everyone who's been on the chat and listening in and sending questions. We're going to collate some of the info questions and hopefully circulate that on LinkedIn, so watch out for that. And then please note that these flash forums are every day on the GIBS website available. So lots of interesting conversations to be had, and we invite you to join all of them. Thank you.